Today we're diving into something that, well, just doesn't quite add up on the surface. Why are some of the world's most resource-rich countries also among the poorest? And often the most conflict-ridden. It's a real paradox, isn't it?
It absolutely is. How can having so much oil or minerals or fertile land actually lead to such devastating outcomes like poverty and chronic instability?
Exactly. It seems counterintuitive.
It's a deep question, and it points to some really systemic problems. So today, we'll explore this phenomenon often called the resource curse. We'll look at how these extractive economies, rentier politics, and even things like climate change all kind of weave together with conflict, especially in the global south.
Right. And our mission here is to unpack how history, particularly colonial legacies, but also political structures, international pressures, environmental factors, how all these things can turn natural wealth into this curse. But also, crucially, why some countries don't fall into that trap. Why do some manage to chart a different course?
Yeah, that's key. We'll be drawing on quite a range of research academic work on rentier theory, some really powerful historical case studies, then even recent climate science.
Okay, great. So let's get into it. First things first. Maybe define what we mean by an extractive economy. What does that actually look like?
Sure. Basically, an extractive economy is one that's built mainly on, well, extracting raw materials, taking things out. So think of a country that relies heavily on, say, mining gold or drilling for oil, or maybe even huge farms growing just one cash crop for export.
Got it. Stuff you take out and sell rather than, say,
Yeah.
manufacturing or services.
Exactly. And the key point is that it's dependent on resources that are finite. They run out or maybe renew only seasonally. This makes the whole economy inherently vulnerable.
And that vulnerability, that fragility is where this resource curse idea comes in.
Precisely. It's this phenomenon where having abundant natural resources seems to correlate with really significant political and developmental problems.
Like what kind of problems are we talking about?
We're talking dictatorships, deep-seated corruption, human rights abuses, sometimes even widespread hunger and serious environmental damage. And very often, all this boils over into actual conflict. It's a grim picture for many nations.
So how did people first try to explain this? What were the early theories?
Well, early on, some influential theories pointed towards global economic structures, sort of neo-Marxist ideas about dependency, suggesting that colonial history left these nations trapped in exporting raw materials.
Okay, so locked into a specific role in the global economy.
Right. Others focused on environmental scarcity, the idea that fighting over dwindling resources fuels conflict. Or the greed versus grievance debate are conflicts driven by pure greed for resource wealth, or by genuine grievances stemming from inequality and marginalization.
So different angles trying to connect commodity exports with corruption and conflict.
Yeah, trying to find that link between relying on primary commodities and ending up with patrimonialism, corruption, and instability.
But you mentioned history earlier. To really get this, we need to look back, particularly at colonial legacies.
Right, absolutely crucial. The roots of this run deep. If you think about European colonial powers, especially after the Industrial Revolution kicked off, they didn't just find resources. They actively, purposefully engineered economies in the global south to feed their own industries back home.
Engineered how?
By turning these territories into outposts. Their main function was to exploit minerals, agricultural produce, timber, whatever was needed to fuel industrialization in the West. They created dependencies.
And I believe the research mentions something quite stark called a regime of impunity. That sounds ominous.
It was. Colonial powers often dismantled existing local political and economic systems. They imposed things like forced labor or made communities grow specific cash crops instead of food for themselves. And incredibly, they often delegated huge amounts of power, almost sovereign power, to private transnational trading companies.
Private companies acting like governments.
Pretty much. Think of the Royal Niger Company in Nigeria, or the British East India Company in India. These companies were sometimes given the right to raise taxes, maintain their own armed forces, essentially running the show for profit.
Wow. And this exploitation wasn't just during the formal colonial period?
No, not at all. European extraction started centuries earlier. Gold, ivory, tobacco, and of course the devastating transatlantic slave trade, which hit sub-Saharan Africa particularly hard. This massive accumulation of wealth in Europe didn't just happen. It was directly linked to the spread of underdevelopment in the South. One fueled the other.
A very unequal exchange.
Deeply unequal. And researchers point to two features from that era that, sadly, often persisted right into the post-colonial period.
Okay, what are those?
First, what's called the preponderant corporatization of public law. Basically, huge monopoly mining or resource rights were given to privileged companies, often foreign ones. Public wealth became private profit.
Right. And the second,
The second is this sort of instrumental value of lawlessness right at the top. The lines between public office and private gain blurred completely. Leaders use state resources for personal or corporate benefit, sometimes called prebendalism or neo-patrimonialism.
so using your public position for private enrichment.
Exactly. And many newly independent states basically inherited this system, this political economy, straight from their colonial predecessors.
That sets the stage quite dramatically. Okay, let's pivot slightly to this concept of the rentier state. What exactly are rents in this context?
Good question. So in this specific context, rents refer to the income a country gets from exporting a gift of nature. Think oil, gas, diamonds, minerals. The crucial part is that this income isn't really generated by the country's own domestic productive efforts, like manufacturing or innovation. It mostly comes from international capital foreign companies paying to extract and export these resources.
So it's like income that flows in from outside based on just having the resource underground.
Pretty much. And a rentier state, therefore, is one whose political economy becomes heavily, sometimes almost entirely, dependent on these external resource rents, taxes, royalties paid by these companies.
And you mentioned this is shaped by colonial legacies and this rentier largesse. Easy money almost.
Yes, often seen as easy money. But here's the critical flaw we see in many, though not all, rentier states. The huge revenues generated often end up being controlled by a small governing elite.
Ah,
And they tend to spend this money not primarily on broad societal welfare or long-term development, but on things that benefit them directly, consolidating power, patronage networks, personal enrichment.
so there's a disconnect
Yeah.
between the country having wealth and the people actually benefiting from it.
A fundamental disconnect. Rentierism in these cases doesn't align with the developmental function we normally expect from a state.
It's interesting how this condition, this rentier syndrome, as some call it, can reshape the whole economy.
It really can. It often crowds out or displaces other potentially productive parts of the economy, like agriculture for local food or small-scale manufacturing. Why bother with the hard work of building those sectors when easy rent money is flowing in?
Right. It creates a skewed incentive structure.
Definitely. And it fosters this convoluted culture of accumulation focused solely on accessing and controlling those rents.
What does that do to society?
Well, the consequences can be dire. When you have elites acting like predators, often in collaboration with external partners, it generates massive deprivation, marginalization, and deep disillusionment among ordinary people.
And I imagine in diverse societies, that's explosive.
Extremely. In places with existing ethnic, religious, or regional divisions, this inequality often leads disgruntled groups to mobilize, sometimes violently, against the state they see as illegitimate or predatory.
Which then weakens the state's ability to function.
Exactly. It diminishes its capacity to maintain authority, leading to what some research calls tinderbox outposts, areas ripe for conflict, these so-called resource wars.
But you mentioned earlier, it's not always a curse. Some countries manage it differently.
That's the crucial nuance. It's not deterministic. Some rentier economies, maybe Libya under certain periods, or perhaps more clearly the UAE, have made conscious efforts to bridge that gap. They've used their resource wealth for significant distributive and developmental programs, investing in infrastructure, education, health for their citizens.
And the result?
The result is often less virulent conflict, maybe more manageable political tensions, rather than outright state collapse or civil war.
Yeah.
Which leads to the big question, what makes that difference? Why do some succeed where others fail?
That's a really critical question. And it suggests maybe just focusing on the state part of rentier state isn't enough. The research points to a broader concept, the rentier space.
Exactly. Focusing only on the state apparatus can be too narrow. The rentier space is a useful concept because it looks at the bigger picture. Think of it as this expansive, often very unequal playing field where all the activity related to getting, controlling, distributing, and using resource rents happens.
So it includes the state, but also other players.
Definitely. It includes the formal rentier state, usually controlled by elites, yes. But it also encompasses counterforces, civil society groups, NGOs, sometimes insurgent movements or militias who want a piece of the pie or want to challenge the system. And importantly, it also includes all those international stakeholders. Multinational corporations, foreign governments pushing their interests, multilateral agencies like the World Bank or IMF.
Wow, so it's a crowded space. And presumably, their interests don't always align.
Far from it. They're often in direct contradiction. You have development spending, how resources are distributed, even fundamental issues like land rights.
In this competition, this logic of predation you mentioned, does it spill outside the formal economy?
Very much so. The ease with which rentier resources can sometimes be obstructed or diverted often creates a thriving shadow economy running parallel to the formal one. This fuels all sorts of dodgy dealings, black market accumulation. Some used to argue oil was non-lootable because it's complex to extract and transport.
Right. Unlike diamonds you can stuff in your pocket.
Exactly. But scholars studying places like Nigeria point to massive scale oil bunkering, essentially, the organized theft of crude oil, completely debunking that idea. Oil is lootable just differently.
And global politics plays into this space, too.
Hugely. International pressures, forces like globalization, or what some term imperial governance, exert what they call negative pressure on these national rentier spaces. Sometimes it looks like trying to break them up internally, a sort of modern divide and rule. Other times it's about trying to construct larger regional or international rentier spaces, a combine and rule approach to make it easier to control strategic resources across borders.
And this can get quite forceful.
Absolutely. It often involves the pretty brutal securitization of energy resources. Think about the rationale behind initiatives like the U.S. Africa Command, AFRICOM. A lot of that is about securing resource flows.
Okay, this framework helps understand the complexity. Let's make it more concrete. The research highlights a really stark comparison. Iraq versus the UAE. Two oil-rich states, very different paths.
Yes, it's a fascinating comparison, and it really challenges that old Tillian adage that war makes states.
Hmm?
In these cases, resource wealth played a huge role, but in opposite ways.
So tell us about Iraq's trajectory first.
Well, after Iraq nationalized its oil industry back in 1961, its state-building project, especially in the 1970s, was fueled by massive oil revenues. It was a classic guns and butter strategy,
Right.
meaning they spent heavily on both military expansion and social welfare benefits, trying to build state power and popular legitimacy simultaneously, funded by oil.
But the guns part became dominant.
Increasingly so. This led to very aggressive foreign policies, most notably the devastating Iran-Iraq War from 1980 to 1988. Even with strategic rents, financial aid from neighboring Gulf states, the war was fiscally disastrous. It stretched the Iraqi state's capacity way beyond its breaking point.
And what did that do internally?
As the state weakened financially and militarily, Saddam Hussein's regime cast around desperately for new sources of legitimacy. They tried pan-Arabism, then shifted to a kind of Iraqi nationalism focused on territory, not ethnicity.
Trying different ideologies.
Right. Then they invoked religious roots, claiming descent from the Prophet Muhammad, and ultimately they fell back on manipulating tribal loyalties to maintain control.
A downward spiral, it sounds like.
It was. Ultimately, that toxic mix of unsustainable militarization funded by rentierism contributed significantly to the unmaking, the eventual collapse of the Iraqi state following the 2003 invasion. A really sobering outcome.
Sobering indeed. Now, contrast that with the UAE. What do they do differently?
It's almost a mirror image in terms of strategy. The UAE, instead of pouring its vast oil wealth primarily into military might, judiciously channeled it into economic development and diversification.
So investing inwards rather than projecting power outwards.
Precisely. Their focus, right from the 1960s onwards, was on building a nation, not just a powerful state apparatus. This meant heavy investment in modern public infrastructure, roads, ports, communications, but also comprehensive social welfare, healthcare, education, police services, and ambitious development projects like Port Rashid in Dubai aimed at building a future beyond oil.
What kind of policies supported that?
They pursued policies focused on nation building, yes, but also on trade openness, attracting foreign investment through things like free zones, and promoting a degree of social justice, for example, through the Abu Dhabi Fund for Development, which aided other countries too.
So a much more forward-looking approach.
Definitely. The UAE has shown a really significant transition. It's moved from being just a rentier state towards becoming more of a production-oriented welfare state. They've actively worked to build non-oil revenue streams.
And that creates more stability.
It seems to. By investing in human capital, infrastructure, and diversification, they've laid foundations for more lasting stability and prosperity rather than relying solely on the fluctuating fortunes of oil.
The lesson here seems pretty clear then.
It really is. The resource curse isn't some iron law of nature. The UAE example shows that if oil rents are managed effectively, with a long-term vision focused on diversification and human development, they can be used for constructive state building and sustainable prosperity. It's about choices.
Choices and governance. Okay, let's bring in another complex case, Sudan. Here, oil seems deeply tangled with conflict and, more recently, food insecurity.
Sudan is incredibly complex. Resource extraction has been central to its political dynamics for a very long time, going back to the 19th century with ivory and slaves. When oil came into the picture later, it acted more like, as one source put it, pouring petrol on the flames of conflicts that were already burning.
So oil wasn't the root cause, but an accelerant.
Exactly. The grievances of marginalized groups, especially in the South, predated oil by decades, even centuries. Issues of historical exploitation, cultural and racial divides, economic neglect that was the tinder. Oil just provided the fuel and raised the stakes dramatically.
How did oil reignite things?
Well, when significant oil reserves were discovered in the late 1970s, it immediately became a point of contention. There were disputes over the boundaries of concession blocks, and crucially, attempts by the national government in Khartoum to control the resources located in the south.
And that led to resistance.
Directly. It was a major factor in the formation of the Sudan People's Liberation Army, the SPLA, in 1983, marking the start of the Second Sudanese Civil War. Control over oil became central to the conflict.
What about international players in Sudan?
They played a huge role. China, notably, became Sudan's biggest oil customer, but also a major arms supplier to the Khartoum government. Their stated approach was business is business, politics is politics, which in practice meant they appeared largely unconcerned by human rights abuses happening in the oil regions. Some argue they effectively facilitated the government's use of force to secure oil production.
A controversial role. What about Western countries?
Their stance was often more ambiguous, publicly condemning the violence, but sometimes simultaneously allowing or encouraging their own companies to pursue commercial opportunities in Sudan's growing oil sector. A kind of diplomatic double game.
And how did the oil money affect the Sudanese state itself?
It massively fueled what researchers call the prebendal and predatory state model. The oil rents gave the regime in Khartoum enormous wealth, much of which was used to buy weapons, primarily from Asia and Russia. These arms were then used to prosecute the civil war and suppress other opposition. Oil money also allowed the regime to expand its patronage networks, buying loyalty, and even manipulating local ethnic conflicts to clear and protect oil field areas.
A pretty grim picture of oil fueling conflict. But paradoxically, did oil also play a role in peace?
Strangely, yes. The prospect of developing even more oil fields and the desire for better terms on international markets and debt relief did create incentives for the government to negotiate. This contributed to the process leading to the Machakos Protocol in 2002 and ultimately the Comprehensive Peace Agreement, the CPA, in 2005. A key part of the CPA was agreeing on wealth-sharing formulas for the oil revenues between North and South.
But those agreements are often fragile, right?
Very fragile. Issues around transparency, exactly how much oil is being produced, who controls the revenues. These continue to be major points of friction and dispute, contributing to ongoing instability, including the eventual secession of South Sudan.
And Darfur, you mentioned oil became relevant there too, even though it wasn't the main resource.
Right. Darfur itself wasn't initially seen as oil-rich, but the politics of oil became a factor. For instance, China's repeated abstentions on UN Security Council resolutions aimed at sanctioning Sudan's oil sector over the Darfur crisis were widely interpreted.
Interpreted how?
As China protecting its existing investments and perhaps keeping an eye on potential future oil concessions in areas like southern Darfur. It showed how the shadow of oil interests could fall even on conflicts not directly about oil extraction.
Okay, so oil is a major piece of the puzzle in Sudan. But now there's another layer, climate change impacting food security, especially in that region.
Yes, and this is critical. A recent study focused specifically on the IGA region, that's the Horn of Africa area, including Sudan, South Sudan, Ethiopia, Somalia, Kenya, etc., shows worrying trends. Climate change is increasing the frequency and intensity of extreme rainfall events, both severe droughts and damaging floods. And this is having a significant direct impact on food security across the region.
Are some areas hit harder than others?
The study identifies specific vulnerability hotspots likely to face longer and more frequent food crises in the future. These include northeastern Kenya, most of Somalia, southeastern Ethiopia, Djibouti, and, importantly for our discussion, large parts of central and northern Sudan.
So climate is a direct driver of hunger crises there.
It is a major driver.
Yeah.
But here's a fascinating and quite troubling finding from that same study. Even in areas that had relatively favorable rainfall patterns during the study period, like parts of South Sudan, researchers found persistent, severe food crises.
Why? If the climate wasn't the main problem.
Conflict. In South Sudan, the food crises between 2009 and 2019 were primarily driven by internal conflicts and displacement, completely overriding any potentially positive climate signals.
Wow.
Similarly, in eastern Sudan, political instability and protests plunged regions into food crises, again, largely independent of rainfall patterns in those specific years.
So political factors can trump climate factors.
They absolutely can. This study strongly suggests that political instability, poor governance, and active conflict can exacerbate climate-related food insecurity or even cause or prolong food crises all on their own, regardless of whether rainfall increases or decreases locally.
That's a really stark reminder of how interlinked these issues are. It's not just resources, not just climate, not just politics. It's the interaction.
Precisely. It's this dangerous synergy, this double threat, where human conflict and political failure amplify environmental stresses and vice versa.
We've certainly covered a lot of ground today, from the historical roots of extraction and colonialism.
To the mechanics of the rentier state and the broader rentier space.
Yeah. Contrasting national paths like Iraq and the UAE.
The complex case of Sudan with oil and conflict.
And now overlaying the impacts of climate change and food insecurity. It's clear that just having natural resources is far from a guarantee of prosperity.
Not at all. This whole deep dive shows how that resource availability interacts with history, political choices, elite behavior, global power dynamics, and now increasingly environmental shifts, creating this complex web that can trap countries.
So the resource course, as we've discussed, isn't some simple automatic outcome. Resources don't inherently equal suffering.
No. It's much more a profound challenge of governance, of equity, of building resilience in what's clearly a very volatile world. The crucial insight, maybe, is that it's less about what resources a country possesses and far more about how those resources and the state itself are managed.
Which leaves us with a final thought, perhaps, for you listening. For countries that do have this abundant natural wealth, is the path forward really just about having those resources? Or is it about building the necessary institutional muscle, fostering genuine, equitable distribution, and crucially, cultivating the political will to harness that wealth for all citizens? Especially now, facing external pressures and undeniable climate shifts.
Yeah, what proactive steps, what integrated strategies can ensure that resource wealth becomes a lasting blessing for the next generation, not a source of ongoing conflict and hardship, a deepening curse?
A vital question indeed. Something to really think about.
Absolutely. It demands ongoing attention, innovative thinking, and policies that genuinely prioritize people and long-term sustainability over short-term gain or narrow interests.
Well said. Thank you for joining us